So with no further ado, I will pass you on to Stan Taylor for his discussion on supporting doctoral supervisors, a Western European perspective.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining me. It's morning in the UK, I'm sure it's afternoon elsewhere, and perhaps evening. Wherever you are, welcome. I have a long-standing interest in research supervision that goes back to my own days as a research student when my supervisor had a laissez-faire model, and while that suits many people, unfortunately didn't suit me very well, and I struggled quite a lot. So that sparked an interest, and later on in life I went into academic staff development. I've worked with supervisors now in 42 universities in the UK, plus right across Eastern and Western Europe, and also in the Far East, in Thailand and Sri Lanka in particular. And I'm currently chair of the Research Supervisors Network and author of its framework for good supervisory practice. Next slide, please. I have a number of publications, and in the field there, a couple that might interest you would be the fourth one down, which is the Guide to Online Supervision, which seems to be pretty relevant at the moment. And perhaps the one at the top, the data on describing the global doctoral landscape, which looks at the numbers of institutions offering doctoral programs, doctoral enrollment, doctoral graduation across the globe. And of course, one thing that does it, which is very germane to what we're doing today, is it shows the way in which Malaysia is becoming a major provider. Next slide, please. The Supporting Doctoral Supervisors, this presentation is part of a larger project, the Making of Doctoral Supervisors. There's the book of it, which came out earlier this year, which has 21 case studies of countries. And next slide, please. And what I want to do is to talk about the background to the Making of Doctoral Supervisors, the project itself, the key findings of that project, analyze those key findings, and finally to come to some conclusions. So if we can start with the background to the project, and the crucial things here, next slide please, are doctoral education is important, and you can read that for yourselves. Doctoral supervision is important, and here there is a substantial body of evidence which is showing that the quality of supervision is if not the major factor in determining the learning experiences of doctoral candidates and their chances of timely completion, and there are some references there. And then in recent years, doctoral supervision has become much more complex and demanding. Historically, it was because all that needed to be a good supervisor was to be active in research, underpinned in the sciences by the master-apprentice model, and in the arts, humanities, social sciences, it was a laissez-faire model. However, over the past 2 decades or so, there have been some massive changes in doctoral education, which I've clustered using a categorization of Hammond et al., some Australian authors, into these 4 clusters of formalization, growth, diversification, welfare, diversification of purposes, diversification of modes of study. And if I may, I'd now like to spend just a minute or two unpacking some of these major changes. On the heading of formalization, I've got 5 categories there. One is student-supervisor relationships. Traditionally, we've looked at that. All over the globe, there's been a process of commodification whereby research students are being encouraged to think of themselves as consumers and of their supervisors as producers. And that has, in a sense, altered the expectations of students of their supervisor. It's ratcheted them up to a higher level. A second area is the duration of studies. Traditionally, doctoral studies took as long as they took, but the longest I know of is one of my friends who took 23 years to get his doctorate. Over the past 3-4 decades, there's been a process that Simon Blackburn of Cambridge has described as McDonaldization. Get them in, get them through, and get them out. And so in most cases, you have up to 4 years to do it. And again, that creates pressures on supervisors, and of course, it creates pressures on students as well. A third change has been in regulation. Traditionally, supervision was compared to a secret garden in which the supervisor and the student interacted and nobody paid very much attention to what went on. Over the past 2 decades, there have been the interpolation of numerous regulations. It's become globally a highly regulated activity, and again, that affects the context of supervision. A further change has been the shift from the single supervisor model to the supervisory team. That has got, or can have, advantages in terms of cover, etc., but it can also have disadvantages where supervisors disagree or have different ideas of the project, their roles, etc., etc. Again, that's something else for supervisors to take care of. And then finally, under this heading, there is institutional context. It was unstructured. One thing we're seeing, particularly in Europe as a result of Bologna, has been a process of structuration with graduate schools, graduate colleges, doctoral training centres, doctoral schools, etc. So it's now taking place within a formal institutional environment. The second, diversification of the candidate population. Diversification of the candidate population. The numbers were relatively few historically. Between 2000 and 2010, globally, the number of doctoral students doubled. Unfortunately, numbers of supervisors didn't increase at the same rate, with the result of many more to supervise. A further trend has been in terms of the internationalization of doctoral education. Again, there have always been people who've moved between countries for doctoral education, but it's become absolutely massive in the past 20 years or so, at least it had before COVID. And so, for example, in many countries, including the UK and France, the proportion of graduate students from outside the country is between 40 and 50%. Another change is academic and social composition. It used to be white pale males predominantly who went into doctoral education. That's now being diversified. I think you'll find over virtually the whole of Europe that the majority of doctoral candidates are female. Again, that's not reflected in the composition of the supervisor population, which creates issues. Another change is responsibility for well-being. Historically, doctoral candidates were regarded as adults who could cope with it themselves, but as a result of a number of studies, there have been studies in Belgium, France, and the UK, as well as the States and Canada, which show a high instance of poor well-being or indeed mental health issues among graduate students. And that's now been accepted as something that institutions have to take some responsibility for, and that responsibility is devolved in terms of understanding the symptoms and directing people upon supervisors. There have been the changes in the modes of study, traditionally full-time. Now, for financial reasons, it's often part-time. In the place of study, this is of course the big change with COVID. It was traditionally on campus. Technology now means we can do it on and off campus, but it's a different ball game for the supervisor. In terms of the purposes of study, traditionally doctoral education was single discipline. Many of the world's problems now need to be attacked from multiple disciplines. It's become multidisciplinary, but of course many of supervisors, self included, have been brought up in disciplinary silos, which creates issues. The number of doctoral awards has proliferated. For many years, that was basically the PhD by research. But now, as well as that, we have professional doctorates, practice-led doctorates, doctorates by contemporaneous publication, and doctorates by historic publication. Again, all with different demands on supervisors. And the final change is in terms of the purpose of the doctorate. Traditionally, you did one because you wanted to become an academic. Now, the data suggests that certainly in Western Europe, 2 out of 3 doctoral graduates are outside higher education 3 years after graduating. Now, all this has had a major effect. Next slide, please. I'll let you read that. Next slide, please. This has been recognized by supervisors. There's a quote there from a study of Holson Malfoy. Again, I'll leave you to read it. Next slide, please. So actively fashioning development, intervening to ensure timely completion, providing tutoring research assistance, facilitating completion and ensuring graduate employment. Next slide, please. But despite the importance of the doctorate itself, the crucial role of supervisors in the student learning experience, the increased complexity of supervision demands on supervisors, comparative studies of doctoral education have paid very little attention to the ways in which supervisors are selected, supported, and recognised and rewarded. So, next slide, please. The project itself, next slide, please, was to compare, the aim was to compare and contrast the arrangements for doctoral supervisors in a sample of doctorate awarding countries across the globe, and objective to find out how they were selected, how they were supported, and how they were recognised, or if and how they were recognised and rewarded. Next slide, please. Collaborators were Margaret Hart-Carley, as announced at the beginning, Carrie Holly, and myself. We edited it, and we got, at the end of it, we got 21 case studies. There are 195 countries in the world. We took 21 of them. That 21 accounted for just under 76% of all the doctoral graduates known in 2017, which just shows you how concentrated it is. Of those case studies, next slide, please, 8 were in Europe, as you can see there, Germany, the UK, Spain, France, Italy, Sweden, Denmark, and Ireland. And we did analyse all of these, but I'm just going to talk for the present purposes about the European case studies. Next slide, please. So we had the contributors that asked to write about selection, support, recognition, and reward. Next slide, please. And the key findings were, next slide, please. In terms of initial professional development, in 4 countries, Denmark, Ireland, Sweden, and the UK, the majority of institutions had mandatory or voluntary initial professional development programs for new supervisors. In a further 3, France, Germany, and Spain, provision in a minority. And in 1, Italy, we actually couldn't find any signs of provision at all. That was initial. Next slide, please. In terms of continuing professional development for established supervisors, that was even more confined. We found evidence of it in only 4 of the 8 countries, Denmark, Ireland, Sweden, and the UK. There was some provision, but it was largely absent in the other countries. And then, next slide, please. In terms of mentoring, this was a feature in only 2 of the case studies, Ireland and the UK. Next slide, please. So the case study showed there were significant variations in the ways that the West European systems approach the professional development of supervisors. And next slide, please. We tried to analyze this in terms of Linda Evans's concept of professionality, the assumptions which underpin conceptions of professional practice. And she represented it as a continuum with, at the one end, practice conceived of narrowly in terms of experiential and intuitively based roles, and at the other, more broadly in terms of requirements for professional knowledge and skills to fulfill complex and formally designated roles. And she described these as the restricted and extended poles of professionality. Next slide, please. In terms of supervision, we defined the restricted pole represented by Ernest Rudd's comment many years ago: if one can do research, then one can presumably supervise it. So the necessary and sufficient condition is to be research active, nothing else needed. Next slide, please. At the extended pole of professionality, this involved not just being research active, but other attributes as well. I'll let you read that. Next slide, please. So at this poll, while being research active is a necessary condition, it's not a sufficient one. You need to have additional knowledge, understanding, and skills, and to be effective, active researchers need extended professionality and they need opportunities for professional development. So next slide, please. we analysed the 8 West European case studies. None of them fitted exactly, but they could be broadly divided into 3 clusters. Cluster 1, next slide please, little if any support for supervisors in terms of professional development, and that case was Italy. The second cluster was nearer to the extended portfolio of professional validity with substantial support for supervisors in terms of initial and in many cases continuing professional development as well. And the 4 there were Denmark, Ireland, Sweden, and the UK. And then we found a third, and within that cluster, there were numerous examples of good practice. Can I just highlight one of them, which was Ireland? It really shows what can be done in a country where there is a clear focus on doctoral education and on and institutions contributing towards improving the quality of it. Those initiatives, I think, are some of the most important ones we find. There were others elsewhere. The third cluster was those in transition. Historically, they've been at the restricted end, but in recent years, there have been major initiatives to improve support for supervisors. So they're moving towards extended professionality. And those ones were France, Germany, and Spain. And we had examples, next slide, please, from there. In France, in 2027, of a large institution into supervised training, there were some initiatives, including a really interesting one at Riviera Ivagili University. Then in Germany, a slow but constant increase in professional development. Now a majority of institutions have them. Next slide, please. So we looked at the reasons why these countries were in transition. We got 2 factors identified. One we referred to before, the association between doctoral education, the knowledge economy, and economic growth. The other one was the Bologna process, which clearly had a major impact in France, Germany, and Spain. But this was not a complete explanation because Italy was also subject to these factors, but there was no change there. So that you know, it's not a properly fully specified model. Just in terms of conclusions, then, very briefly, next slide, please. We've arrayed them in terms of professionality: 1 at restricted, 4 at extended, 4 in transition. We've tried to explain this as far as we can. And just to say, it'd be interesting to repeat this study in a few years' time and see if the country at the restricted pole have moved on and how far the transitional ones have developed towards the extended pole of supervisor professionality. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Any queries you can take up later.
Well, thank you very much, Stan, for the illuminating discussion. I will now pass you on to Douglas for his presentation, Challenges for Doctoral Supervisors.
Yes, thank you very much, Matt, and thanks also to Stan for another excellent overview. One of the things I like about Stan's work is it's very embedded in literature, and there is an extensive and growing literature for doctoral education. So that, I think, really helps us to understand this activity from a scholarly point of view. And in Matt's introduction, he also mentioned that EPIGEUM started out in 2005, and it reminded me that, you know, I've had connections with EPIGEUM since then. When I was Dean of Graduate School, we started out developing a training skills development program, which I think was one of the first programs that EPIGEUM produced. And, you know, I've always enjoyed working with them and found their programs to be very effective. And of course, they have evolved significantly over the years as our understanding of the online environment has also developed. So really today, I wanted to pick up on a few key issues, thinking about the nature and purpose of doctoral education, and really think about that from the perspective of both supervisors and candidates. So what you can see here is a statement that summarizes very briefly some of the extensive work that Stan has done, namely that doctoral education and research continues to evolve and develop new approaches, new methods, you know, notwithstanding the fact that we have an internationally recognized and robust qualification, which is based on candidates undertaking original research. nevertheless, there are a large number of different approaches, a variety of methods, and a variety of ways in which supervisors will approach their role. And as Stan has said, new methodologies, changes in candidate population, geopolitical factors where we're beginning to see significant growth in a range of countries providing new opportunities for doctoral education. And all that leads to a very important principle for me, which is set out at the bottom there, namely that professional development and support for doctoral supervisors is an essential indicator of a high quality doctoral environment, both to assure success, but also, I think, as a tool to attract the strongest possible candidates. So next slide, please. So what we can see here is a summary for me, what I consider to be some of the most important changes that will impact on supervision. Increasing drive of diversity of the candidate population, so that we will see at some point a population of doctoral candidates that is more representative of our own society. Increasing collaboration, both in terms of thinking about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary doctorates, where we combine different disciplinary perspectives, which of course can reveal hidden complexity, bring new insights, new methodologies, and so on. And of course, for which communication and language are a key aspect of navigating the sort of complexity of different disciplines. We also have collaboration across sectors, involving industry, involving society, involving policy groups, and involving other non-academic organizations, which is really important. And, you know, we've also seen a growth in the role of the doctorate as something that has wider societal benefits. So, for example, solving problems and challenges associated with something like the Sustainable Development Goal framework. So those new models will also, that Stan talked about, will also require, you know, different approaches for supervision, where we have cohorts based on shared experience, a much more tightly defined structure, periods of preparation for the project, skills development, an emphasis on developing the individual as a researcher, as a more authentic experience of becoming someone who has the capability to undertake an original research project. So all of that change places additional demands and complexity on supervisors. And, you know, it requires additional support, it requires additional information to be communicated to supervisors. And of course, in the last year, we've also learned a very significant amount in terms of having to manage and supervise candidates during the global pandemic, where most activity has moved online. So next slide, please. So what we can see here are some thoughts and reflections from the perspective of doctoral candidates themselves. You know, so the key role of a supervisor, or one of the key roles, is to help and support a candidate to undertake a personal program of research. You know, so that leads to us having to think about and consider how candidates view themselves. It's also about helping them to develop skills, helping them to develop their confidence, helping them to develop their own individual personal identity as a researcher, belonging to a community of researchers. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a word cloud that I generated from looking at the UK's Quality Assurance Framework for Higher Education Qualification descriptor. So this effectively sets out the expectation of the QAA in terms of what universities should be looking for in candidates who receive a doctoral award. And you can see there a very wide range of different attributes, different skills, different knowledge, different abilities. And I've sort of highlighted some of those terms slightly larger. And you know, one of the key concerns candidates will have, particularly at the start of their doctoral project, is, you know, will I be able to undertake original research? You know, what does new knowledge look like in my field? You know, how can I be confident that I am working at the forefront of my discipline, or indeed at the forefront of an interdisciplinary project? And so these issues are very much in the mind of candidates, and it's very much up to supervisors to provide support, guidance, and structure. But of course, the extent of that support and structure will vary very much by candidate, and also will require the supervisors to have some insights and understanding of where the candidates are in this complex process. Next slide, please. So extending the ideas here, for me, supervision is increasingly about looking after the whole person. You know, we need to recognize that supervisors are not experts in many areas. You know, they're not trained counselors, they're not experts in mental health and well-being, but they are the primary contact. And I think it's becoming increasingly important that they need to have some level of awareness of, you know, how candidates invest themselves in the process. It's very intensive. It requires a great deal of commitment. And, you know, for many candidates, success can bring a lot of pressure on them. And candidate well-being, as a consequence, is now recognized as a key issue. And, you know, as it says on the slide, supervisors are not experts, but they can guide and they can support candidates. And so I think there's a really important issue there about supervisors being able to at least guide and provide signposts to other forms of support that requires them to adapt and to adjust the way they approach the supervision of their candidates. And, you know, as it says at the bottom of the slide, that's about having a professional, supportive and enabling relationship with the candidate. Next slide, please. So sort of putting all this together, you know, some of the key activities that doctoral supervisors have to undertake nowadays is they must clearly advocate the purpose and the requirements of the doctorate. You know, what is the candidate expected to do? What might the outputs at the end of the project look like, notwithstanding the fact that there can be significant variation and change during the period of study and research. They have to enable candidates to adapt as they progress, both in terms of revealing new insights and complexity, as well as dealing with challenges and other contextual factors. And of course, we've seen a very significant disruption from COVID recently, so supervisors have to prepare candidates and enable them to continue their research during this difficult time. They have to emphasize very much that the candidate has to develop their own personal understanding and not rely too much on the views of others. And it's about growing in confidence and supporting the candidate to develop that intellectual rigor, that scholarship, that ability to enable them to capture their new knowledge, new insights in their doctoral thesis and the other items that they might have to present for the examination, if it's practice-based or professional doctorate. Obviously, they provide disciplinary expertise and guidance and can very much help the candidate to establish where the work sits within a broader field or broader discipline. And that's a key role in terms of getting the project to maturity and successful completion. And in the case of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary projects, supervisors have an important role as a point of reference in helping the candidates bring together different perspectives from different disciplines that might have different methodologies, that use a different language, that have different assumptions and so on. So putting that all together can be a challenge for candidates. And I think supervisors have a really important role to play in terms of framing that complexity and guiding the candidates so that they can successfully develop a methodology that is appropriate for the research project and the particular challenge. And the final point is a really important one. You know, a supervisor is a key role model for all aspects of being an academic in terms of research, in terms of interacting with others, in terms of how they behave, in terms of how they communicate, in terms of setting standards and expectations. And, you know, supervisors need to be aware that, you know, they're very much under scrutiny by their candidates nowadays. Next slide, please. And that links, the last point on the previous slide links to the idea of research culture and the wider environment. Colleagues in the UK will be aware of the PRES survey, the Postgraduate Research Experience Survey that's run by the Advanced HE, formerly the Higher Education Academy. And that has consistently identified research culture as an area where doctoral candidates would like to see more support, more development. And, you know, it's a really complex question. You know, what is the culture of research in your institutions? You know, what is the wider environment in which doctoral candidates are undertaking research? And of course, supervisors have a key role to play in maintaining, as it says there, a healthy and vibrant research culture to support the candidates. They're very much seen as role models. They set the tone of the working environment and the relationships and the way that they support and encourage, enable candidates, the way they challenge candidates, the way they act as a sort of sounding board, a provocation and encouragement, all the different aspects of supervision that have to come into play at different stages during the candidature for a successful and robust research project. You know, supervisors have to play all those roles. And I think for me, what the SDS program does is it provides opportunities to benchmark these different approaches, to identify and share good practice, because in the program itself, it presents a whole range of different ideas, different frameworks, different approaches, and that can really help to engage the academic staff as supervisors in your institutions in conversations using the SDS program as a sort of benchmark. Next slide, please. So just thinking a little bit more, this is very much for UK, so apologies to people watching overseas, but hopefully you will nevertheless find this useful. The Quality Assurance Agency has recently revised the UK Quality Code and indeed has significantly slimmed down the sort of core expectations and requirements for institutions. And alongside that, they provide supplementary advice and guidance. So this is the document that refers to research degrees, as it says there. And the guiding principle here is that providers, which of course are universities and research degree awarding institutions, must ensure that each student has an appropriately skilled and knowledgeable supervisory team, which includes a main supervisor as the key contact. Supervisors should be provided with sufficient time, support, and opportunities to develop and maintain their supervisory practice. And then later on in the document, it gives some further guidance there. All supervisors, including those working in industry or professional practice, are expected to engage in professional development opportunities to equip them to select and supervise research students effectively. So really, this is setting a very clear benchmark in the UK that there is a national expectation that supervisors will be appropriately skilled and knowledgeable. They will develop and maintain their supervisory practice, and the institutions need to think about how this can be achieved, how they can support supervisors to do this, and how they can enable time for this to happen in an effective way. So next slide, please. So sort of picking up on this, you know, as it says at the top of this slide, there is a lot of information that supervisors need to know and they have to manage nowadays. So I think it's important to sort of break it down. You know, what is essential for supervisors to know? What are the key things that they must know from the outset? You know, what do they want to know? How are you going to provide them information that they think will be useful and relevant to them? what's the best way to present it, through some sort of structured program or activity, through a handbook, through creating supervisory communities, through using SDS. These are all different ways in which you can provide this information to supervisors. But what coherent framework best enables the supervisors to engage and extract from this large amount of information, information that is useful and valuable to them. And I think, institutions need to think about how SDS fits within this overall institutional approach. You need to have, I think, high-level institutional leadership and advocacy for the importance of supervisor training and support. Something at the sort of vice principal or vice rector level, I think, needs to be setting expectations at institutional level. That requires some kind of structure. So if when you're using SDS, how does that fit within your institutional approach? And on the right-hand side of this slide, what does that approach communicate to supervisors about how your institution values their status, their workload, and values the important task of research supervision? So next slide, please. So in this final slide from me, it's encouraging you all to think about how do you make the most of SDS. It's a valuable, sophisticated, high-quality resource. Epigeum assembled a team at the time of global experts who put a considerable amount of time and effort into developing this program. How are you going to make the most of this resource? How are you going to determine, what the benefits are? How are you going to incorporate SDS into a wider culture and environment and build on current strengths of support already in place at your institution? And ultimately create an expectation of engagement that will lead to a more enhanced experience for doctoral candidates at your institution, which is ultimately, I think, the goal that we would all wish to see. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Douglas, for that excellent discussion. There's lots to think about from our two guest presenters. I'll now pass you on to Emma Gallen for a brief exploration of the Supervising Doctoral Studies programme.
Thank you, Matthew. And thanks very much, Stan and Douglas, for two really interesting and thought-provoking presentations. I think from what we've heard so far, there is a real need for doctoral supervisors to feel confident and fully supported in balancing a really complex set of roles. And this complexity and diversity is something that the team behind the second edition of Supervising Doctoral Studies was thinking very deeply about over the 18 months course of developing the programme. So I'm really delighted to introduce to you today the new edition of Supervising Doctoral Studies, which published at the end of 2020. It's a comprehensive and interactive online supervisor development programme, providing effective training in the core principles and practices of doctoral supervision to equip new and more experienced supervisors in supporting doctoral candidates' development into independent researchers. It recognises research supervision as a complex and distinct academic practice, requiring supervisors to develop a specific set of skills, knowledge and understanding to guide a diverse range of candidates to successful and timely completion and beyond, of course. And the second edition has been fully revised and updated to ensure that all supervisors are equipped to deal with these emerging developments and challenges in this field of practice. It can be used flexibly as a standalone programme, or to support and complement existing supervisor development initiatives at institutions as a comprehensive resource that can be accessed online at any time. Next slide, please. So it's a 5-hour programme consisting of 10 30-minute modules, and we've taken a modular approach to the structure of the second edition to improve navigation in response to some feedback and to ensure that the programme is more manageable and accessible. Supervisors can choose to take these modules in order as a full development programme, or they can dip in and dip out and access modules at point of need or according to institutional requirements. As you can see from this programme overview, we've aimed to be comprehensive in the content coverage and to address all aspects of a doctoral journey, whatever that journey may look like. And for some time now, as Douglas has mentioned, the supervisor's role has needed to focus on supporting their candidate in their more holistic development as a researcher, rather than simply completing a research project or just producing the thesis. And this has been reflected in the coverage and design of the second edition. It's gone through quite a significant update from the first edition, and all content has been revisited and revised to ensure that it's fully up to date, current and relevant. And in particular, we've included new and expanded content on particular areas or topics of current priority, including, but not limited to, researchers' mental health and well-being, power dynamics and respectful relationships, team supervision, online supervision, employability, especially beyond academia, diversity and inclusion, and research culture. Next slide, please. So Supervising Doctoral Studies was developed through the process of global collaboration that Matthew outlined at the start of this webinar, and it drew on the expertise and experience of a team of advisors, authors, an expert review panel, and 19 partner institutions to ensure that the finished programme is of the highest quality. Next slide, please. We've been extremely fortunate to work with a wonderful advisory board, which alongside Douglas and Stan included Dr. Margaret Kiley at ANU. All three have provided guidance on the overarching vision, aims and shape of the programme, and have reviewed and advised on the developing materials at every stage of the process. Stan, Douglas and Margaret authored a number of the modules as well, and the authoring team also included Dr. Claire Aitchison, Dr. Callie Guerin, Professor Rachel Spronken-Smith and Dr. Alex Standen. And it really was a great source of personal pleasure to work with this group, and their expertise, their understanding of what support doctoral supervisors need, and their creative activity ideas are very much present on every screen in the programme. Next slide, please. Something that we've benefited from greatly is the range of expertise and perspectives that the review panel and development group have brought at every stage as part of this collaborative approach. So the sharing of a variety of viewpoints, best practices and systemic differences in approaches has really helped to shape the programme and refine the content significantly. Some of the key priorities and themes that emerged in the review feedback that we've been very careful to incorporate include diversity in all its forms, i.e. the diverse range in the candidate population, the supervisors themselves, the types of doctorate, modes of study, motivations for study, disciplines, sectors, terminologies. I could go on. The level is something that we've paid a lot of attention to, and we've received some very useful feedback on ensuring that the materials are suitable for both new and more experienced supervisors. And thirdly, ensuring that scenario-based activities are authentic and believable has been really important as part of the development process, and some really great ideas for these have been provided throughout. Next slide, please. At Epigeum, we put in a lot of work into planning and developing the learning design for our programmes. And for Supervising Doctoral Studies, our main focus was on how to most effectively support knowledge acquisition for this audience's level of experience, how to increase engagement with the programme content, how to ensure that the supervisor is an active driver of their own learning, and how to ensure that the activities chosen most effectively develop and test the learning points. So we therefore developed the pedagogical framework on screen for this programme, and it underpins the module content throughout. So input content is content designed to provide information and to introduce key concepts and contextual material. And this can be done very effectively through the video, animations, infographics, and through incorporating supervisors and candidates' voice. Development content is content designed to develop knowledge and test concepts of varying levels of complexity. So this could include activities such as multiple choice questions or reflective text entry, branching activities, etc. Each module closes with an application screen, which is either a scenario or a real case study, plus interactive questions, or again, another branching activity to enable the supervisor to apply the concepts they've learned in a realistic set of circumstances. Next slide, please. So I'm now just going to spend a couple of minutes running very briefly through some of the main features of the new edition, but you should also be able to request trial access so you can have a look through and test out some of these activities and features yourself. So as I mentioned, all content has been revised to ensure it's up to date and relevant, and new and expanded content on topics of current priority have been included. So for example, respectful supervisory relationships, as you can see in the sample screen on the slide there. Next slide, please. Most screens feature clickable buttons called pods at the right-hand side that supplement the main activities and contain additional information, resources, useful links to follow and practical examples. Each module also actually contains a resource bank, which also has lots of useful sources and links to further reading. So the Your Context pod, that's flagged up on the screen there. So depending on the chosen method of accessing the programme, these can be customised by institutions, and you could include your own local information or links to relevant policies and guidance, for example. We've also included leadership and management pods throughout, which are aimed at more experienced supervisors that might be looking to develop their role in, say, the management of doctoral studies and supervision in their department or their institution. And these contain extra guidance, links and resources. Next slide, please. Scenario-based learning features really strongly in every module and often in combination with questions or a branching activity. So supervisors have the opportunity to decide what they would do in that position and explore the consequences to practice applying the guidance they're given in the module. Next slide. Video and audio interviews with both supervisors and candidates at the development group universities feature in every module of the programme, and they share their experiences, some real life case studies and practical advice. And in many of the modules, users can select from either arts and humanities, social sciences or STEM video options to hear the interviews with people in the field that most closely matches their own. Next slide, please. Interactive graphics and professional animations provide context and clarify key concepts. Next slide, please. A pre-programmed diagnostic tool based around a range of scenarios recognises that users will bring their own particular set of skills and experience to the programme, and this can vary greatly from supervisor to supervisor, of course. The diagnostic tool will ask users to rate their levels of confidence in each given scenario, and as well as providing immediate feedback on the modules that they might find helpful, the tool will generate a personalised list of recommended modules to prioritise or spend more time on for that particular supervisor. Of course, there's material in every module that will help to enhance the practice of all supervisors, both new and more experienced, but this tool will help users to navigate their way through the programme and to set their priorities for development. Next slide, please. So lastly from me, each module ends with a summative reflective question tied to one or more of the module learning outcomes to consolidate the learning. Completion of this question and ticking the checkbox that follows allows administrators to run reports on who has completed the programme and can also be used to generate a certificate of completion.